now. Okay, everybody. So welcome to Project Makom's panel on Judaism and other religions. So the way this is going to work, first of all, I want to thank my parents for coming here. This is the first Project Makom event that they've come to. So this is super exciting. So everyone be on your best behavior, no profanity, no obscene stories. Thank you. So, and hello, Levi Stern, and who are you? What's your name?
One of these are for Yaakov.
Yaakov. Okay, welcome, Mindy. So this panel is about Judaism and other religions, and we have our three resident experts. This is my husband, Yoel Schaper, who has more Christian books than the average pastor. This is Pesach Sommer, and I don't know quite what title to give you except like all-around maven. So Pesach knows everything, and in addition to being intellectual, is also super sensitive and a very wonderful person. So that's Pesach Sommer, and he's going to be talking about Judaism's view on the moral non-Jew and anything under that rubric. And then we have Shlomo Pill. Shlomo Pill is finishing their PhD in Islamic American and Jewish jurisprudence. He's a professor at Emory, and you went to Michael Brody's Zionist Institute of Atlanta, right? And he will be talking about Islam. So we're going to be having, every speaker is going to be addressing 20 minutes to their central topic, which will be Islam, Christianity, Jewish view of the moral non-Jew. And then we have a bunch of questions that we got in from online, and so we'll be addressing those, and we'll open the floor for questions as well. So without further ado, here we go. So we dropped Eastern religions, but you can ask questions. We don't have an Eastern religion expert per se.
Is Shlomo Pill the Eastern religion expert?
No.
No? Muslim.
Only Muslim.
Okay, and we'll be starting with Pesach Sommer.
Thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully I'll set the bar nice and low for the two experts here. I just want to start off with, I guess, a little story. A Rebbe of mine, we were once talking about chinuch, the challenges of chinuch. We worked together for a few years, and we're talking about the challenge, when you've been teaching for a long time, that you have like these students and they're acting up, and it's really, really frustrating. And he gave a very interesting mashal. He's not so much anymore. He was a very big hockey fan, and that was in the good old days before the New York Rangers won the Stanley Cup. And there was it used to be a thing when you went to games. If you were an Islanders fan, as I was growing up, that the last time the Rangers had won the Stanley Cup was 1940. There was a cheer. You were actually doing 1940. It was a way of making fun of them. Unfortunately, in 1994 that changed, but that was the way it went. And then this Rebbe mine said that when you would go to Rangers games, the fans were not just booing the fact that you were losing that night, but they were booing the fact that it had been over 50 years since you won the Stanley Cup. And, he said, of course, that didn't make a lot of sense because, after all, these players weren't even alive back then. It's not their fault that they've been losing all these years. But he said, you kind of, look at them and you're like, oh, you've been losing for 50 years. And he said that, similarly with students, sometimes when you have a kid acting up, you're thinking to yourself, you've been driving me crazy for 30 years old, but the kid's only, 17 years old. And it's important to remember that, not to look at, the kid as if he's the same one who's been doing it all along. So the reason I mention this is because as we talk about the views of, Judaism's view of non-Jews in general, the moral non-Jew, etc., I think there's a certain tendency that exists within the world to kind of lump all non-Jews together and to kind of look at Jewish history about how Jews have been treated by non-Jews and to say, well, look how they've treated us. Whereas, obviously it's not, the non-Jews who are alive today are not the same ones who were, who were alive at the time of the Crusades or the Khmelnytsky, pogroms or even the Holocaust. And I think it's just important that, that we recognize that sometimes the positions that we have or the way that we view non-Jews is really based on sort of a very an unreasonable standard that we sort of hold non-Jews responsible for anything any non-Jew has ever done, and it's just part of look what you've done for the last 2,000 years. So I think that's just to start off. That's an important perspective. I also want to just say, it's a very, very complicated topic. You literally, I couldn't, but a scholar could really write a book on this. It's just saying there's so much to talk about. I'm going to try to focus on some general issues, and hopefully it will touch on some important ideas. maybe will be followed up to some degree in the comments they'll make. But obviously, I mean, what I'm going to say is not going to cover everything, but hopefully it'll touch on some important areas. One of the things to think about also, I mean, is in general, when you have a small group of people, and I've thought about this a lot. I mean, how do you have a small religion in a world? I mean, I sometimes tell my students, I remind them of this, that there are religions in China that you've never even heard of that have more people than Judaism. It's an important thing to keep in mind. We talk about like the three major religions of the world. Judaism, it's fairly small. So how do you help Judaism survive in an environment where you're surrounded? Forget about people who are against you, but even just people who are not against you. How do you help you survive? And I think that one, part of that is there's a certain degree to which we try to set up walls, try to keep in us versus them, not even in a negative way, but that there has to be a certain distance, right? I mean, from the Torah itself, it talks about the Zayin Amin, but it really, it's understood to be talking about non-Jews in general. You talk about, rules against intermarriage, right? Because if you marry, other nations, you're going to get swallowed up, so you have rules like that. Chazal, of course, later on, come up with all sorts of takanos that make it that you're not supposed to drink their wine and you're not supposed to cook food and things like that. Again, there has to be efforts. There definitely has to be a certain sense of there's an us and there's a them. But what I think it doesn't have to be, and what I think that hopefully I'll lead to tonight, is that you can have a very distinct group, a very strong sense of who we are and who they are, but without having to demonize the other side, without having to view them as negative. So just to start off, for example, there's a pasuk. It's part of a pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim in Perek Yates, about very, very famous, probably quite possibly the most famous words from the Torah, even in the general world. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You should love your neighbor, your friend, like yourself. So who does that cover, right? So if you look in general, I guess I'll just throw this in. Also, of course, it's very important that we can't talk about the Jewish view of anything. In other words, it's not going to be like, this is what Chazal believed, because there's no such thing. There's no person, Chazal, there's no monolithic view that they have. They had different views. But if we talk about V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, the standard understanding that you find among Chazal is re'acha b'mitzvos, that it does not apply. Not only does it not apply to non-Jews, it doesn't even apply to non-observant Jews, right? It's only those who are re'acha b'mitzvos, those who are your fellow mitzvah keepers. But even in Midrashic literature, I mean, the Tana Devei Eliyahu, which was written about 1,000 years ago, suggests that V'ahavta l'recha kamocha actually does include non-Jews as well. So there's even again, it's not from the time of the Gemara, as some of the better known drashos that it excludes non-Jews, but Tana Devei Eliyahu, which was written around the time of the Gaonim, it certainly suggests that non-Jews were included in that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing is also, it's really this past week's parsha, right? Yaakov and Esav are meeting up. And and Yaakov is scared. And what is the relationship between Esav and Yaakov? Very famous words of the Rashbi. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, that it's halacha Esav soneis Yaakov. So again, that Esav hates Yaakov. So the question is, what does that mean? Does that mean that the person named Esav always hates the person named Yaakov, and therefore even when he embraces him, really inside his mind there's hatred? Or is it a bigger idea? And I think a lot of times it gets quoted these days as this bigger idea that it represents that inherently, that no matter what's going on in terms of the non-Jews, no matter how nice they appear to be to you, never ever forget Esav soneis Yaakov. No, that really, even when they're being nice, it's really, it's really not true. But again, this view, which I don't know why it's so popular now, why the assumption that Esav means the Christians or the non-Jews and Yaakov, that's not really, if you look at the way it was stated, it really seems to be talking about the particular individuals. And later on, I'll even, back that up, some people who read it this way. So, again, as we talk about these things, a lot of it has to do with perspective.